Hello, 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 everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back. We're going to be finishing up Chapter 9, dealing with destructive emotions in Beyond Religion, Ethics for a Whole World by the Dalai Lama. Chapter 9 was a longer video, and as I said in the previous video with the first part of Chapter 9, I think that definitely pays homage to just how much we as individuals and as a society deal with destructive emotions, whether it be toward ourselves or toward others. So I think that there is a definite, clear reason that this chapter is probably the longest in the book. So we're going to read exactly the last half in Chapter 9 in this video. So the section that we left off on is called Taking a Stance. In order to go about dealing with these destructive emotions, it is first of all necessary to adopt a general attitude or stance toward them, a stance of opposition. Such a stance involves recognizing that the law of opposition, whereby positives cancel out or neutralize negatives, applies not just to the physical world, but also to our inner or mental world. In the great wisdom traditions, we find clear lessons both on the mental states that are to be tackled and on the need to cultivate and deploy their antidotes. If no opposing forces exist for our destructive emotions, then there is nothing we can do about them. However, if opposite positive forces do exist, then they can become powerful antidotes. For example, the main antidote for anger is forbearance, for greed is contentment, for fear is courage, and for doubt is understanding. I would say for doubt, I guess if you're looking at this from a more faith-filled aspect, for doubt would be faith, but maybe because he's looking at it from a secular point of view, he says it is understanding, since not everybody comes from a place of faith. Sorry, my hair has just been crazy lately. Okay, we're just going to let it be. A key element in generating an effective stance of opposition toward negative emotions is a deep recognition of their destructive nature and a conviction that we both can and should strive to overcome them. This conviction can then serve as the basis for an enduring resolve to tackle them. We can develop this element of general stance by giving attentive, compassionate consideration to the destructive effects these emotions have upon the lives of ourselves and those around us. We can reflect on the fact that such emotions, hatred and greed, for example, not only are the sources of many of our personal problems, but also are the ultimate sources of many of our collective problems, such as war, poverty, and environmental degradation. Simply adopting a stance of opposition toward our destructive emotions will have an immediate influence by giving us a sense of caution, which is a critical defense when such powerful emotions strike us. So it is very important to give careful consideration to the negative impact of each of our most persistent destructive tendencies. If our mind is lost, even for a short time, to an emotion as destructive as hatred, we may say and do terrible things. The damage created by one moment of intense hatred can be devastating. In Buddhism, the human mind is often compared to a wild elephant. As some farmers know well, when an elephant is agitated, it can wreak great destruction. But an unruly, agitated human mind, given to fits of rage, malice, obsessive craving, jealousy, or arrogance, can wreak even more destruction than a rampaging elephant and can ruin lives. To counter these tremendously powerful destructive emotions we all have within us, we need to develop very strong enthusiasm and determination for the task. This enthusiasm will come in large part from considering the negative impact of those emotions. In addition to being powerfully destructive in moments of intense feeling, they can also have an insidious, corrosive effect on our inner well-being. Gradually and surely, they undermine our inner peace, deprive us of mental freedom, and hinder the expression of our empathetic nature. the source of our greatest happiness. In fact, we could even say that all violence and destruction in the world are the result of hatred. The damaging consequences of hatred can be observed at individual, family, and global levels. So I encourage people to contemplate the destructive nature of such emotions on a regular basis. This is a subject to which I return in Chapter 11, where I describe some simple mental training practices which can be helpful as a means to developing conviction about the need to overcome such emotions, and as a means to training the mind. I think that we are seeing that, especially if you live here in the United States, and even if you don't and you follow the things that happen around the world, we are seeing a lot of that right now with the elections coming up. There is a nation that is divided, and even a world for other countries that are very clear on who it is they support. We are very divided between one half of the people that are voting for one person and one half of the people that are voting for the other. And the way that I look at it is that just as when a person holds a religious belief or a belief of faith in some particular thing that they hold steadfast to, that is how each person feels about the party that they are voting for or that they support. And in their mind, I would hope the person that they are voting for is the one that has the best interest for all. It is simply a difference in perspective when you look at it. It is a difference in the way that each individual looks at the world. And as hard as that may be for some people to understand, and even as hard as it may be for me to understand that when I see especially people being so hateful to each other when they don't agree on things, or when I see people arguing about things that aren't even really the issue, they're just showing hatred toward each other simply for thinking differently, it really shows me just how divided we are at a time when we should unite. Our country right now is very vulnerable. We don't have a president. Our president stepped down, and we've been given a vice president, but that vice president was never sworn in as a president. We've never been more vulnerable in so many ways, yet we've never been more divided. And that's a very scary thought. And I think a lot of people in America right now, I can't speak for other countries because I don't live there. I'm just telling you what I observe, are very scared. They're very angry. They're very fearful. And from those emotions comes hatred. Hatred toward anyone that thinks differently, and hatred toward society in general. You go about your day, people don't smile anymore. They don't walk around with any happiness around them, around their energy field. They're broken down, they're beaten, they're tired, and they're living in fight or flight. That is the majority of society these days. The only thing that you can do for yourself and for society is to work on you. You can't do anything about what anyone else is feeling, but you can raise the area when you raise your energy, when you work on yourself, just by being present. And you may never see the effects of that. You may never see what a small gesture can do for somebody who may really be struggling, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to see it. You have made a difference, no matter how tiny it is. And those tiny things add up. They really do. When you think about how many tiny things you can add to every encounter you have each day that's positive, that can really add up if everybody did that for one another, letting go of all the differences and opinions you may have, or all of the prejudices that you may hold, and remembering that we are all connected. We are all one under source, under God, under the universe, under our higher power, however you want to refer to that beautiful energy of love that created us and runs through each one of us. All right, understanding the causes of affliction. Having developed a strong resolve to tackle our destructive emotions, we can then reflect upon their causes. Where do these disturbing emotions come from? Well, we may respond, they come from the world we live in and from others who do us wrong. If it weren't for other people, we may think we would have no reason to feel aggressive, resentful, or anxious. This response, seeing the source of our problem in external conditions, is a natural one, especially when we are not used to paying attention to our internal mental processes. We tend to see the troublemaker as something outside ourselves. If we reflect deeply, however, we discover that the real troublemaker is within us. Our true enemies are our own destructive tendencies. For if the external condition is the real source of our trouble, it follows that if, say, 10 people are confronted with the same external situation, each of them should encounter the same difficulty when faced with that external condition. This, we know, is not the case. The way we react emotionally to any given situation depends to a large extent on our own outlook, our own attitude, and our own emotional habits. As part of learning to gain a measure of control over our emotions as a step toward developing a calm mind, it is important that we take a measured and, above all, realistic approach to dealing with the world and the problems we face. Take anger, for example. Is getting angry really a helpful response? If we have a hostile neighbor who constantly provokes us, does getting angry do anything to remedy the situation? What is more, if we allow anger and resentment to fester, they will gradually wear us down, affecting our moods, our sleep, even our appetite. And if this happens, our hostile neighbor really will have won some kind of victory. This is the way of a foolish person, for it is a kind of self-torture. If, in contrast, we can sustain some tranquility of mind, maintain our composure, and carry on with our normal lives, then we will be much better equipped to determine the most effective course of action for dealing with such situations. The truth is that when we are agitated, we are not much good at anything. Even hitting a nail straight can be problematic. Just a quick thing that happened to me the other day. I was driving back from my house. I had to go home at lunch really quick. I work and live in the same town. And I was getting on the freeway to head back just because it's quicker. And I was merging on, going from a 2-lane to a 1-lane, like merging onto a freeway. And there was nobody next to me. And all of a sudden, this Mustang comes up next to me and totally cuts me off. And there was a woman in the passenger seat. And she looked over at me with the most evil and hostile grin, it seemed like. And at first I was like, what the heck did I do? What's your problem? And I started to get upset about it. And then I thought, you know what? I'm not going to let that person that I don't even know, that I'm never going to see again, upset my day like that. Whatever the reason that they did that for has nothing to do with me. And they went on about their driving. I went on about mine. Nothing came of it. And I just let it go. And it felt really good to just let it go. When most of the time in the past, I probably would have honked on my horn, flipped them off, muttered about it to myself the whole rest of the way to wherever I was going, and then told my coworkers about it. But over time, I have learned I'm not at the place yet where my mind doesn't automatically go to that first reaction, but I am at a place now where I can correct my thought and step back a little bit from it before I allow it to consume me. I don't smash it down and not care about it. I care about it for a second. I let it go through me and then I let it go. Instead of holding on to it or stewing on it, I let it go after a moment. I allow myself to feel it, because I don't think it's healthy to just always pretend that nothing ever bothers you and everything is okay when that's not the fact all the time for us. I do think it's healthy to let yourself feel something for a moment and then go to a higher place, even if it's just for yourself. I found that much more helpful to myself. Upon reflection, then, we start to see that it is a mistake to understand the causes of our disturbing emotions purely in terms of the things or the people who trigger them in us. If we step back and take some time to reflect, we find that even though our grievances may to some extent be legitimate, our feelings of irritation and frustration are actually rather unrealistic and often exaggerated beyond what the actual situation merits. We may also find that such disturbing emotions recur over and over, not just because of external factors, but also because they have become something of an emotional habit for us. When we start to see things from this perspective, we can begin to recognize that these destructive emotions feed on themselves, that the more they are indulged, the stronger they become. To realistically address such self-perpetuating destructive emotions, therefore, requires us to turn our attention to our own habits of mind. Instead of looking to blame others and the world around us, we should first look within ourselves. This is a point the 8th century Buddhist thinker Shantideva makes very well when discussing the problem of anger. If we wish to prevent our feet from being pricked by the thorns, he says, it would be foolish to attempt to cover the whole world in leather. Much easier and more effective is to cover the soles of our own feet. In the same way, it is a mistake to think we will get rid of anger by changing everything in the world that makes us angry. Instead, we should look to change ourselves. What anger most depends on for its perpetuation is our own inner dissatisfaction, the state of latent irritation or lack of contentment, which in Tibetan we call yi mi dewa. It is this general underlying mental unease which makes us susceptible to the triggering of destructive emotions, especially anger. Such inner dissatisfaction is the fuel upon which destructive emotions, such as anger and hostility, depend. Therefore, just as extinguishing the initial sparks is a more effective method of preventing fire damage than waiting until the fire is blazing, in the same manner, dealing with the underlying causes of discontent is a more effective way to prevent destructive emotions from doing damage, rather than waiting until the emotions become full-blown. I don't remember which book it was I read. I think it was Living Untethered. I can't remember, but the author talks about the issue with having expectations in life and expecting the world to be what it is that we want, whether it's the weather, whether it's the traffic, whatever it is. Well, we hope that it's not rainy that day or it's going to ruin our plans. Why won't this driver go faster? They're ruining my schedule. When we live our lives in a way that we expect basically society and the flow of life around us to bend at what works for us, is when we stay in a state of irritation and anger. And that obviously feeds upon itself for more irritation and anger in all of our interactions throughout the day. So sitting back and taking each moment for what it is and not allowing yourself to get angered by it, and realizing that getting angered by it isn't going to change anything for the better, is a really nice place to start. Even if it's just, oh, I have 10 more seconds at the light to relax because the person in front of me went so slow that I missed the green light. Or, oh, maybe I would have had an accident had I would have left on time and I ran late for a reason. There's always a reason that things happen. And even though sometimes we don't ever know why, we don't ever see why, taking a moment to step back and finding the tiniest ray of light or appreciation for whatever thing is happening in our life that has thrown us off our day can definitely help. And not expecting the world around us to operate in the way that we prefer, because that's simply not the way that life is. And when we let go of expectations, we find that things naturally do run smoother, and that even when they don't, it doesn't bother us as much, so they do run smoother. It's sort of allows just a weight to be released from you when you let go of expectations in that way. Even expectations from other people. Letting go of those things actually bring back far more rewards, and you realize that things do go a bit smoother, from the tiniest things to the bigger things. All right, the next section is titled Emotional Awareness. If we are to succeed in effectively tackling our destructive tendencies, first of all, we must observe and study them closely. For dealing with destructive propensities is not merely a matter of suppressing them. Our emotional and psychological habits can be very deep-seated and often have developed over the course of many years. So if we do not address such emotions honestly but bottle them up, this can potentially have very counterproductive effects. In fact, ignoring or suppressing emotions can actually aggravate them and make them intensify until they surge to the surface and, like a swollen river bursting its banks, find expression in unexpected negative thoughts and behavior. Instead of suppressing our destructive emotions, therefore, we must be open and honest with ourselves and bring mindful awareness to what triggers them, how they make us feel, and what kind of behavior they provoke. This kind of introspective attentiveness to the way these emotions arise within us and manifest in our behavior is what I call emotional awareness. It is only by practicing such awareness, by facing these emotions directly and giving them careful scrutiny, that we can gradually bring them under control. Here again, it is worth considering our behavior in terms of 3 dimensions, at the levels of body, speech, and most important, mind. If we can maintain introspective attentiveness to these 3 aspects of our experience and behavior, then we can, by stages, develop an emotional awareness which will be very helpful in restraining our negative impulses. Attentiveness. Attentiveness to emotional experience is very beneficial, but at first it is surprisingly difficult to achieve. In fact, trying to identify emotions at the moment they arise may initially seem impossible. In large part, this is because they are simply so swift, and in that split second when powerful emotion arises in us, it seems to occupy all of our consciousness. As a result, the process by which they unfold remains opaque to us. Such difficulties are natural and should not make us feel dejected or discouraged. Instead, we should remember that emotional awareness will only develop gradually, with patient perseverance. For this reason, we cannot begin by tackling our emotions directly, but have to start by focusing on their outward manifestations in our behavior. In this context, it is helpful to consider the onset of destructive emotion as a kind of causal chain, which starts with an external stimulus and ends with our behavioral response. The aim of emotional awareness is to bring our attention or mindfulness into this split-second process and thereby to gain some control over it. Imagine, for example, that a door slams. Next comes our physical perception of that stimulus through the faculties of hearing, sight, and perhaps touch. Initially, this is a purely physical event, not yet colored by any interpretation. But then, less than a millisecond later, comes the interpretation. Here, an element of projection or exaggeration is often involved. The split-second judgment that so-and-so deliberately slammed the door as an insult, for example. Interpretation is very quickly followed by the emotional response, perhaps anger, annoyance, or irritation. Then finally, also often very quickly, comes our behavioral response. We say something or do something in retaliation. I know I stopped already a few times, but this just happened to me yesterday. I wasn't feeling well and I went to lay down in my bedroom, and my husband and my kids were home and up and about and doing their thing. And I didn't tell anyone but my husband that I was going to lay down. And my son came into the house from outside and he was just yelling and just being a kid, and he slammed his door. And my first thought was to be angry because I was trying to rest. And then I immediately was like, okay, A, I didn't tell him I was sleeping or trying to sleep and didn't feel well. And B, he's a kid. Even if I did tell him, he probably would have forgotten because it was a while ago and he hadn't been in the house. I could have laid there and stewed on it and allowed it to ruin my time to rest. I let it go. I let it go. I just said, you know what? We all make mistakes. He had no idea. And I'm not going to open the door and scream, I'm taking a nap. Can you please be quiet? You just woke me up. I would have done that in the past, and I didn't do that yesterday. and it was much more pleasant. That's all I have to say. Much more pleasant for me and probably much more pleasant for the household. So it didn't just benefit me. It's always a domino effect when we're in a mood, right? All right. Once we understand this causal chain, the aim is to interpret its flow by, as it were, catching ourselves and bringing awareness into the process. Generally speaking, it is easiest to start near the end, between the emotional reaction and its behavioral expression. Then, as we become more familiar with the process and our emotional awareness develops over time, we can work our way back along the causal chain, with the ultimate goal of quelling or eliminating the afflictive emotion altogether. Catching oneself. Thus, our initial efforts should be directed toward ensuring that our destructive emotional responses do not translate into physical or verbal action. The idea is to catch ourselves before we start exploding and to exercise restraint. This reminds me of a well-known Tibetan story about Ben Gungyal, a former robber turned spiritual teacher. One day, while Ben was visiting someone's house, his host left him alone. Since he was so habituated to stealing, his right hand instinctively reached out to take something. At that very instant, he caught himself literally grabbing his right arm with his left and screamed, "There is a thief! There is a thief here!" To help us learn to catch ourselves, it is useful to become familiar with the ways in which our destructive emotional experiences affect us physically. For example, what does it feel like when you first become annoyed? Does your heartbeat change? Do you feel any tightening in the face? Is there any tension in your arms or shoulders? Or what do you feel when you first encounter a sight that disgusts you? Is there any tensing of muscles? Then again, what sensations accompany feelings of jealousy or envy? Perhaps you feel this in your stomach or in your chest. As well as learning to recognize the physical manifestations of our emotions, we can try to observe our physical and mental responses to these situations. Do we act in a certain way, say certain things, have certain thoughts? Do we clutch at our foreheads or clench our fists? Perhaps we feel an urge to walk or to stand, or maybe just to fidget. Does our voice change when we become agitated? Perhaps the sound becomes louder or shriller. Do words come quicker to the mind? If we are working or talking when such an emotion arises, how does the emotion affect our work or the content of what we are saying? Paying attention to such details helps us familiarize ourselves with our emotional states. And with greater familiarity, we gain greater control. Often the simple acts of detaching ourselves from these emotional states and examining them help them subside. Once you become quite familiar with this process and begin to have a measure of success in restraining your behavioral responses, you can then move one step along the causal chain and try to prevent the emotion itself from reaching an explosive stage. In other words, you can learn to calm yourself the moment you become aware of the onset of strong emotion. Doing this may involve, for example, taking several deep breaths. Or it may involve simply diverting your mind from the source of irritation. Or you may be able to view a given situation in a more positive light, as in the example of the Palestinian youth who learned to see the image of God in the faces of the soldiers at Israeli checkpoints. Sometimes, even if the actual situation is tragic, looking at it in the context of its multiple causes and conditions can help diffuse strong negative emotional reactions. It is also helpful to view the situation from different angles or perspectives, so that what looks like a tragedy from one angle can also be seen to have positive byproducts. As you become more and more familiar with this approach, you will gradually gain greater mastery to the point at which you may be able to catch yourself before the emotion even arises. By becoming aware of how feelings such as anger, irritation, or annoyance usually arises in you, you can learn to recognize what triggers them and can therefore arm yourself against them by bringing awareness to bear earlier in the process. Eventually, through practice, you can desensitize yourself to the triggers themselves. by not allowing an element of projection to distort your interpretation of events. This final stage can be very difficult, but if you can achieve it, it will also be tremendously liberating. For even when you encounter the stimulus, hostile words from another person, for instance, your awareness will guard you against instinctive interpretations which are clouded by exaggeration and projection, thereby enabling you to respond calmly and with discernment. The question of moods. Ooh, that's a big one. In the United States in recent years, I have enjoyed a number of dialogues with Dr. Paul Ekman, one of the pioneers of the scientific study of emotion, or what is called affective neuroscience. In Dr. Ekman's view, it is not our emotions, which he describes as fleeting, that are the most harmful to our well-being, but our moods. While emotions come and go quite quickly, moods are more enduring, and because they are largely latent, underlying our state of mind, but without any particular focus. They can also be somewhat hidden to our conscious awareness and therefore harder to tackle. It is moods, Dr. Ekman says, which makes us more susceptible to certain emotions, and it is to them that we should turn our attention. This, I think, is a helpful observation. In my understanding, emotions, moods, and personal traits can all be treated as kindred phenomena, which lie along a kind of continuum, each having a more enduring quality than the former. For this reason, the fundamental ways of dealing with them are largely the same. However, the question of moods also raises the issue of a person's general level of energy, both physical and mental. In Buddhist tradition, there is a strong emphasis, particularly in the context of mental training, on countering the opposing problems of excessive laxity, dullness, or sloth on the one hand, and excessive excitement on the other. I think these kinds of advice, which I discuss further in Chapter 11, may have some bearing on the issue of tackling our moods. Also, while moods may appear to be very difficult to dislodge, I think we have all experienced a mood lifting very quickly in response to some good news. This shows that they are not as stable and enduring as they may seem. Sometimes a mood can be the product of some emotion bottled up inside. And when you release that emotion by talking with someone, perhaps apologizing for something you regret, or even sharing a joke, your mood can quickly change. Of course, such relief can be temporary, somewhat like the relief you get from taking painkillers. So in the end, the most effective way to deal with moods is to deal with the underlying emotions themselves. There is no doubt that dealing with our negative propensities is very challenging. Faced with life's daily setbacks, we can all too easily fall into old negative habits of mind, such as frustration, anger, or despondency. What we need, therefore, is a constant renewal of our effort to live by the values we want to uphold. All right. So that completes the last half of Chapter 9, dealing with destructive moods. I hope that if you've not resonated greatly with the chapter so far, that at least this one you can find something from that will greatly help you step back and think a little bit about, goes my hair again, about being realistic in sort of getting a hold over recognizing your triggers, recognizing the signs before they're even visible to anybody else or even to yourself sometimes. And the more that you recognize these things before they occur, the more you can get in front of them, next to them, right beside them, to master your own, whatever it is, negative emotion, fill in the blank, and to gain mastery over that. And as time goes on, as the Dalai Lama says, you can then get so unattached to something that used to trigger you, and it just simply doesn't bother you anymore, that you really aren't bothered. You're not suppressing anything. You're just really not bothered. What a great place that would be to be in, wouldn't it? All right. Chapter 10, we're going to be talking about cultivating key inner values. And I think there's only 11 chapters in this book, so we are almost done. And I think, let me take a look here. Chapter 10 is pretty short, so we should be able to read it in one video. Chapter 11 is a little longer, so we'll probably break that up into 2 videos, including just a short afterword from the author. So we'll stop right there. And until next time, as always and as usual, and I mean it, I know I say it at the end of every video, but I really mean it from the bottom of my heart. Please take care of yourself. Please take care of those around you. I will see you very soon for chapter 10. Take care. Bye-bye.